Hi, and welcome to my second video. So, just to recap my first video, I introduced the old world map that I've made here, and I'm going to be talking about this quite often. And the whole theory of my first video was that Lehi circumnavigated Africa in 600 BC. We know that because Herodotus the historian describes a sailor that circumnavigated Africa in 600 BC, and the way that sailor described Africa is identical to the way Alma describes his land that he lives in. So the whole theory is that Lehi circumnavigated Africa in 600 BC, and therefore the rest of the Book of Mormon takes place in the Old World, mostly in Africa, but not all. And the sailing to the New World never happened. So when we're looking for the Book of Mormon lands, we've looked in the New World and we've come up with a lot of different theories. And for this video series, I'm just going to be presenting this possibility and this theory that Lehi circumnavigated Africa, did not sail to America, and therefore the Book of Mormon takes place in the Old World. So I mentioned I'd be introducing my Lehi in the Wilderness map. Here it is. Lehi in the Wilderness. So this is my map. I'm going to be talking about this in this video. I'm going to be introducing this whole map throughout these videos and talking about each part as I come to it, and that's going to take several videos to do. So in this first video, I'm just going to be talking about this leg of the journey from Jerusalem down to approximately Cairo. Obviously, the mainstream theory does not have Lehi coming into Egypt, and mine does. So I'm going to be talking about the differences between those two theories and why I think Egypt is the location for this first leg of the journey and not elsewhere. So that's part of what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So just to recap, when you think of Lehi's journey for this model, you would think of something like this, where Lehi sailed around Africa and ended where he started, and not something like this where Lehi sailed to America. So this is not the theory that I'm going with right now for these videos. Okay, I got this from the church's website, and I just want to show it first because they kind of show a possible, they call it possible, they're not definitive about it. They're saying this is a possible route for Lehi in the wilderness. When the Book of Mormon opens, Lehi's in Jerusalem, and he travels down to the Red Sea, and then he travels through Arabia down to Yemen, where the Nahum is, and then from there he goes east into Oman, and that's where Bountiful is. So I think this map is wrong for several reasons that I'm going to talk about in my videos. I'm just going to try to keep it limited to the first part in this video. But yeah, I think it's wrong, and I think going into Egypt is correct. So let's pull up the Book of Mormon here and start reading about Lehi's leaving Jerusalem and his journey in the wilderness. So here we are in 1 Nephi chapter 2, and I'm going to start with 4. I'm just going to recap 4. It says that he departed with his family and his possessions, his tents and things. And in 5, I'm going to read 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. I'm going to go ahead and read those quickly. 5, and he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, and he did travel in the wilderness with his family, which consisted of my mother Sariah and my elder brothers who were Laman, Lemuel, and Sam. And it came to pass that when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. And it came to pass that he built an altar of stones, and made an offering unto the Lord, and gave thanks unto the Lord our God. And it came to pass that he called the name of the river Laman, and it emptied into the Red Sea, and the valley was in the borders near the mouth thereof. And when my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, he spake unto Laman, saying, O that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually flowing into the fountain of all righteousness. So what we read here is that Lehi leaves Jerusalem, he comes down to the Red Sea, then he goes 3 days, and he arrives at a river. So everyone that wants to present a model has to, in theory, would have to find this river that flows into the Red Sea. So right here, the river would have to be somewhere up here, flowing into the Red Sea near the beginning of the journey. And I'm going to talk about the mainstream idea of where that is here in a moment. But first I'm going to mention why I think that his journey was not down Arabia, but rather into Egypt. What I discovered is that there's a man named Carsten Niebuhr who was an explorer. He was Danish, and in 1761 to 1761 he took the Danish Arabia expedition. So you can read about him, and you can read about his expedition here on Wikipedia. So here's a map of his expedition. He started up here in modern-day Denmark, and he came down, and the part of the journey I want to focus on for this video is right here around Cairo. I want to show what he said about his journey from Cairo to Suez. So if we look on a map, the part of the journey I want to mention is Cairo to Suez. So that's obviously Cairo is on the Nile River and Suez is on the Red Sea. So that's important when we think about what Lehi did, traveling from the Red Sea to a river. And he says it was a continually flowing river. Okay, so now I have opened up Carsten Niebuhr's book that he wrote after his expedition. It's called Travels Through Arabia and Other Countries in the East, Volume 1. I'll leave the link to it in the video description so that you can see. And again, I want to focus on that part of the voyage from Cairo to Suez. So here he says, Chapter 2, Voyage from Cairo to Suez. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I want to tell you that he leaves Cairo on the 28th, right here, and he finishes the journey on the 30th of August. So that's the 28th to the 30th. So if you think about a caravan, he clearly describes that he's on camels, which becomes important because when we're looking for this 3-day journey, we often assume that Lehi was on camels, and then we try to do the math, the simple math between how far a camel can go in a day versus how many miles we think the location is for our theory. And here, I'm not really doing that. I'm relying on this evidence that Carsten Niebuhr left Cairo on the 28th and arrived in Suez on the 30th. Lehi's journey would be in reverse. So obviously he's going the other way. I don't want to get that confused. He's leaving Suez near the Red Sea and traveling towards Cairo where the river is. So obviously Lehi's journey would be in reverse. And here on the top of page 176, when he's describing the city of Suez, he reiterates that 3-day journey and says, all other necessities of life for both men and the domestic animals are brought from afar, from Cairo, which is 3 days' journey distance from Suez. So here he says Cairo is 3 days' journey distant from Suez. So again, if we look at the map, he says he left Cairo on the 28th, arrived at Suez on the 30th, and then he reiterates it by saying Suez is 3 days from Cairo. He says Cairo is 3 days from Suez. Another very interesting thing I found is that when his expedition was over, the map of Arabia was updated. I've done a lot of research into these maps. This is a famous map maker, geographer to the most Christian king. He made a lot of maps, and his son took over and continued to make maps. But the new map of Arabia, you can get this free on the Library of Congress website. I'll leave the link. And it says here, with additions and improvements from Mr. Niebuhr. So we can see that this map, a new map, that means it's updated with Mr. Niebuhr's additions and improvements. 1794. So that's, 20-something, 30 years after the expedition. This map is published. So the part of the journey I wanted to talk about was from here, Cairo to Suez, and you can see a line here that he would have taken. But what I found is something very interesting. The Nile River flows north, but the Nile River comes down, it goes around the Dongle Aben, and right here, near modern-day Abu Hamad, we have these words, 3 days journey. So, pretty wild, 3 days journey. This is the Nile River, and this is the Red Sea, and we have 3 days journey between the two. So, at the very least, if you were to have this map published in a book and find it, you don't know anything about the old world and you see this, you would have the impression that the Nile River is a 3-day journey from the Red Sea. Unfortunately, this is in the wrong spot. It would be great if it was actually written right up here, where Carsten Niebuhr said he took a 3-day journey, but it's not. It's written in clearly the wrong spot. So that's really unfortunate. And probably a lot of people are going to think that this is meaningless because it's in the wrong spot. But I still find it very relevant. The Nile River, 3 days journey to the Red Sea, printed on a map. So, going back to my Lehi in the Wilderness map, my theory is that Jerusalem down to the Red Sea, and then this journey is the 3-day journey. And the river that he arrived at is obviously the Nile River. So, that's pretty exciting and pretty different from the mainstream theory, which I presented here from the church's website. So, that's interesting. Okay, so the criticism I'm going to receive, and the reason that the Nile River has not been considered as a candidate so far, is because clearly the Book of Mormon says that Lehi came down to the Red Sea, he named his son after the river that he discovered, and the river flowed into the Red Sea. So, clearly the Nile cannot be that river because the Nile flows into the Mediterranean. What I want to point out here is my theory on why the Book of Mormon would say that the Nile River flows into the Red Sea. The reason is because of the keyword fountain. So in verse 8, it says the river emptied into the Red Sea. So that's a problem. That can't be the Nile. But then here in verse 9, it kind of clarifies, and it says, when my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, he spake unto Laman, saying, Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness. So, the fountain of the Red Sea is also associated with something called the fountain of all righteousness. And I believe strongly that this word fountain is something that Herodotus mentioned. In my last video, I mentioned I was going to bring this up. Herodotus says, remember, Herodotus is describing a sailor, and I pointed out in my last video that that sailor is very likely Lehi himself. Lehi is the sailor Herodotus is talking about. And here in Book 4, Chapter 42, Section 2, he says, Necos, king of Egypt, first discovered this and made it known. He's talking about Africa. When he had finished digging the canal, which leads from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, he sent Phoenicians in ships. So here in the exact same sentence where I am claiming that the Phoenician in the ship is Lehi, Herodotus also mentions that the Pharaoh dug a canal, which leads from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf. Now, the Arabian Gulf is wrong. Herodotus should have known to say Red Sea, but he doesn't. He says Arabian Gulf. So you might not realize what he's talking about at first, but what he's talking about, we can see on Wikipedia, is the Canal of the Pharaohs. The Canal of the Pharaohs, also called Ancient Suez Canal or Necos Canal. Again, Herodotus said Necho built it. That's controversial. Some people don't think he did, and some people don't think it got built until later. Herodotus says that he finished digging the canal, so the canal was finished. Here's the Canal of the Pharaohs. It goes from approximately here over to the Red Sea. These are the Bitter Lakes and then eventually into the Red Sea. So this is what Herodotus is talking about. In the same sentence that he says the sailors set out, he mentions the Canal of the Pharaohs. So my theory is that this is Lehi's word for fountain. When Lehi came down to the Red Sea and he encountered the Canal of the Pharaohs, he simply called it a fountain. So it's a matter of just kind of translating and realizing what an ancient person like Lehi would have called a canal, which is the first canal in history and maybe didn't even have a name yet. And he calls it a fountain. And that is why the main Nile River flows into the Mediterranean, but the fountain that he is talking about is just the Canal of the Pharaohs that flows into the Red Sea. So that takes a little bit of the Nile River and it diverts it into the Red Sea. And it also makes it possible to circumnavigate Africa. Like Herodotus said, That's why the Pharaoh wanted to build it, so that he could circumnavigate Africa. He could bring his ships up the Nile to a certain point, then take the canal and make it into the Red Sea. So that's obviously strategically smart for the Pharaoh to want to do, for all sorts of reasons, like trade and warfare and etc. So I believe that is Lehi's fountain of the Red Sea. Let's go back. I believe that the fountain of the Red Sea is the Canal of the Pharaohs. And this is another great example of the lost internal consistency, which is lost when you don't realize that Lehi stayed in the old world, because the fountain is used again several other times, and every time it is referring to the Canal of the Pharaohs. The angel uses it when the angel speaks to Nephi after the Tree of Life vision, which I'm going to talk about in a later video. And Moroni uses it when he discusses a prophet crossing into Africa, just like Lehi did. Moroni uses that word fountain, come unto the fountain of righteousness. So clearly the fountain of righteousness is being used as a metaphor for Christ. We're going to talk about that. But it is also a geographical landmark that is consistent after you realize that the Book of Mormon takes place in Africa. So in that video where I talk about the angel says that the fountain becomes filthy. That's a reference to comparing it to what Lehi said, the fountain of all righteousness. The angel says the Nephites are destroyed by the Lamanites. That happens in Africa, on the Nile. And that is why, metaphorically, this fountain, the Canal of the Pharaohs, is now filthy. The Lord's people in Africa have been destroyed. The fountain is no longer the fountain of righteousness, like Lehi said. It is now filthy and the depths of hell, like the angel says. That's because it's the same fountain. It's the Canal of the Pharaohs. So that is what I wanted to point out right here. So, pretty exciting stuff. Let's go back and just recap a little bit. Lehi came down to the Red Sea, took the 3-day journey, and the fountain is the Canal of the Pharaohs. Now, the mainstream version of what I've heard most is that the Valley of Lemuel and the River Laman is approximately here in something called Wadi Tayyib Al Ism. So, we look at a Google map. We come down here. If Lehi came down to Aqaba, he then took 3 days' journey to Wadi Tayyib Al Ism right here. And if you zoom in on this Google map, you can see that someone actually wrote Valley of Lemuel on the Google map. So that's a Book of Mormon reference that someone's added to the Google map. Why don't I think that Wadi Tayyib Al Ism is correct? Wadi Tayyib Al Ism is an interesting place because it's used by locals of this area to point to the waters of Moses. They think that Moses crossed the Red Sea here. The water there is a reference to him splitting the rock and providing water for the children of Israel. And Mount Sinai is in this region. But the reasons I don't think that this is a good candidate for the Valley of Lemuel and the River of Laman is because, first of all, we don't know how far this is on camel. The Book of Mormon says it's 3 days, and modern LDS are saying that it's 3 days, but we don't know. I can't find any evidence that it's 3 days. Nothing to compare to the evidence that I found for Carsten Niebuhr saying his journey was 3 days. It's also on the map in the wrong spot. That stinks that it's in the wrong spot, but it's on the map. And every day of that journey is documented. If we go here today, we could maybe hire a camel and see if we could do the journey in 3 days. I believe if we went to Cairo, we could hire a camel and we could recreate that journey that Carsten Niebuhr took in 3 days. I think that's certainly reasonable. I don't see any reason to think that he would have lied when he documented it so well, even giving the dates, August 28th to the 30th, etc. So, a lot of people have been talking about this as the River of Laman. Another reason I don't think this is correct is because there's no river here. This isn't a river. It's not a river that we would think of that Lehi would want to associate with his son being mighty and flowing continually. That's not what we have here in Wadi Tayyib Al Ism. A wadi is a dry riverbed. You don't call a river a wadi. If the valley has a river in it, it's not a wadi. So wadis are common all throughout this area. All of these are wadis. And this is Wadi Tayyib Al Ism. So just from the name, we see that there's an issue there. Some people say that this is a stream in the valley. And you can see this little trickle of water here. And they're saying that that is the River Lehi. And that this is a year-round spring. And that means that this valley is the Valley of Lemuel and the River Lehi. I'm sorry, but I just don't think that that is what Lehi saw. And that is what Lehi said he wanted to compare his son to. It doesn't make any sense to me. So, unlike the Nile River that flows continually, this is very dry for most of the year. It does flow occasionally after rain. The rain does fill up this valley and it does reach the Red Sea. That spring water dries out before it even gets to the Red Sea. Maybe if we can look at one more image, we can see that this is dry. This is dry. There's no water coming out of this valley. And this is how it is for most of the year. So you can see that clearly right here from this image. So if that is the River Lehi that flows into the fountain, into the Red Sea, it's not even making it to the Red Sea. So that's unfortunate. Another reason is that when it does rain, every 8 to 10 years or so, there's an unusual amount of rain, and this whole valley becomes a raging flash flood. And everything in the valley, like trees, and they built a little bridge in here for foot traffic, it all got completely wiped out. And it just doesn't seem like a good place for Lehi to be camping. It would be like camping in a slot canyon. So that's another reason I just don't think it's correct. If you go to YouTube, you can look at videos. Here's a video from Book of Mormon Evidence, Valley of Lemuel, and you can see they think it's right there. And they kind of show some images here that I want to just show. Like they show a river. Now they do show a river, and then they do show the truth that it looks like this. But still, I just think they're giving the wrong impression. This isn't what we're seeing over there. The river needs to be continually flowing. That's what Lehi says. And this river is intermittent. So it doesn't flow continually. So that's something interesting to consider when you're considering where that continually flowing river is. And whether or not it's in Wadi Tayyib Al Ism or whether it is the Nile River, which is what I am proposing. So, that's my video. Lehi came down to the Red Sea here at Suez. The 3-day journey is over to Cairo, and that's the continually flowing Nile River. That 3-day journey is so important because it's also mentioned by Alma. Later on, I'm going to make a video about that, about how Alma uses that same reference, 3-day journey, when he crosses that distance. It's used to symbolize crossing from Africa into Asia. Not so much as whether it's a 3-day journey, because, maybe you could take it slow and do it in 4 days or whatever. But if someone says, I took the 3-day journey, it's a reference to a location as much as it is how many days the journey was. When Alma says, I took the 3-day journey, the Book of Mormon reader is supposed to know that that's the same 3-day journey that Lehi took. And I'm going to show that in later videos, and so that's kind of exciting. And again, that's internal consistency that you don't have when you put Alma in the New World and Lehi in the Old World. So that's another example of lost in internal consistency. Oh, I can't speak anymore. Okay, that's the end of my video. In the next video, I am going to be discussing the next leg of the journey, which is up the Nile River to Elephantine Island. That is Lehi's river camp, I believe. So Elephantine Island, there's evidence there for Lehi. The altar to the Lord is there in ruins, and there's evidence for Sariah there. So that is where Lehi camped when he sent his sons back to Jerusalem to get the brass plates, and then again to go back for their future wives. So that's going to be exciting. I hope that you come along with me, and I hope you watch my next video. Thanks for watching this one. I'll see you in the next one.